Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chav Beis, Volume 22, the first Sicha for Parshas Vayikra. This Sicha will explain the custom that when a Jewish child is inducted into Cheder, into Torah learning, that we begin first by reading with the child several verses from the beginning of Chumash Vayikra, of the Chumash which discusses the karbanos, the offerings, the sacrifices to Hashem. As an introduction, just several things to get familiar with. Number one, Toiras Koyanim. Typically in the Medrash and in the Gemara, this Chumash, that is the third book of the Torah, which discusses primarily the offerings, the karbanos, is referred to as Toiras Koyanim, literally the Torah, the teachings of the Koyanim, the priests. Perhaps, maybe this is the source of why in the world at large, secularly, it's known as the book of Leviticus. Another thing, the word tahor, which literally translates as clean or pure, it usually in the context of karbanos or of purity of a Jew is a reference to being ritually pure, or even something being kosher versus not kosher. Another thing to familiarize ourselves with, we know that the Avos, that the patriarchs, Avrohom, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the Gemara says that they, quote, Kimus kol Torah kula, they fulfilled the entire Torah even prior to its being delivered officially at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. Another thing, on Rosh Hashanah, we say several extra blessings in the Musaf prayer. And they are consistent of a group of verses. There's Malchios, which speaks about the kingship of Hashem. There are 10 verses. Then there are Zichronos, remembrances, 10 verses from the Tanakh, which discuss various times which Hashem, quote, remembered us, remembered the Jewish people. And then there is the psukim of Shofros. All these psukim, all these verses have or should have a direct connection to Am Yisrael, to the Jewish people. Another thing to familiarize yourself with, in the status of a child, of a Jewish child, there are different time periods. There is when a child is very, very young, and they're considered to be tinoikos, literally like little children, little toddlers almost. Then there is a stage in where the child is already considered mature enough, although the child is not yet bar mitzvah and fully obligated in fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs, yet the child has already a status close to it as the child is already higia lechinuch. He reached the age of education, meaning the child is considered mature enough that the child is expected to perform mitzvahs almost similarly to an adult. Another thing to get familiar with is the concept of Yerusha, inheritance. According to Jewish law, in order to inherit something, one doesn't have to be cognitive, one doesn't have to be in a mature state. Even a little baby, by virtue of the fact that it's the child of a deceased parent, in this case a father, the child already inherits everything by default, by the fact that it is a child of that parent. Let's get into the Sicha. So the Medrash says, Amar Rab Asi. Rab Asi said, why is it that we begin teaching tinoikos, little children, in Toiras Koyanim, and we don't start from Chumash Bereshis, right from the beginning of the Torah? He says the reason is because let the tinoikos who are tohoidim, let the tinoikos who are pure and come, and because the tinoikos are pure, and the karbanos are tohoidim, the karbanos are pure, so let the pure ones come and engage in purity in those pure things. Now the question is, what does this exactly mean when we say that the karbanos, that the offerings are pure? There are those meforshim, those commentaries who explain, either this means that the karbanos need to be brought in purity, that means in order to offer a karban, you have to be in a pure state, or perhaps it could mean that through the karbanos, by means of offering a karban, one becomes pure, one becomes clean from sin. But the Rabbi says this is problematic. This is not really what it could mean. Why? Because both of these explanations explain not what the Medrash says. the Medrash doesn't say that the karbanos bring purity, but rather it says the karbanos are pure. So therefore we need to find something deeper. What does this really mean? On the other hand, it's very interesting that to say that the word purity goes directly, is a direct indicator of the korban, also seems to be problematic. In other words, it's not understood by itself, because never do we find in the Torah, in reference to a korban, that it has to be, quote, pure. We find a criteria that it has to be choicey, that it has to be clean of any mum, of any blemish, that it has to be shalom, it has to be whole, but not that it has to be tahor. So what does it mean? Now perhaps we would be able to explain it this way, that the status, the idea, the concept of tahorim relates to the karbanos as they were prior to the giving of the Torah. As we know, the Chazal tell us that prior to the giving of the Torah, if one wanted to bring an offering, one can bring from any offering that one wished to, whether it's a behemoth, whether it's an animal, whether it's a bird, whether it's a wild animal. It didn't even have to have the criteria of being clean from any mum, from any blemish. Rather, it had to just, the only criteria prior to Matan Torah was that it had to be tahor, it had to come from those animals which later would be kosher, which would be kosher animals. Now, what would be the connection to here? What would be the connection? And maybe perhaps we can suggest this is the reason why the Medrash uses this expression in reference to the karbanos, because children, these little children whom we're talking about, who we're referring to, are also, quote, pure. They're in the state of purity, and they're in the state of being, so to speak, prior to Matan Torah, because they're not yet in the obligation status of keeping Torah. Remember, they have not yet reached the age of, quote unquote, chinuch, of education. Thus, perhaps we can say this is the connection, that we're referring to the karbanos as they were prior to Matan Torah, because we're dealing with children who are, in a sense, also prior to Matan Torah. Now, the Rebbe says that this is still problematic, because the Medrash clearly states that we teach the children Torah's Kohanim. Now, what is Torah's Kohanim? Torah's Kohanim is part of the Torah. Torah's Kohanim is where we read verses from the Torah which talk about karbanos. So why then would we be referencing back to karbanos as they were prior to Matan Torah, as the Rebbe explained, in the state, quote unquote, of Tahorim? Now, in the Medrash Tanchuma, after it quotes this very same Medrash, it adds the following. It says, therefore, quote, therefore, I consider it for them as if they are standing and offering before me a karban, says Hashem. This teaches us, says the Medrash, that even though the Beis HaMikdash is in a state right now where it is not in existence, it has been destroyed, and there isn't actually an active karban that's able to be offered, but if not for the, quote, the children who read in the teachings of the karbanos, the world will not be able to exist. Now, the question is, the Tanchuma itself, right after this, continues and it says, therefore, says Hashem to his children, to the Jewish people, if you are occupied, if you are involved in reading the portions about the karbanos, I will consider it to you as if you're offering a karban. So from this it comes out that it's not only the children, when they're occupied in reading the parsha of the karbanos, that they, quote, keep the world in existence, but rather that each and every person that studies the parsha of karbanos, it's also as if they are offering karbanos and keeping the world in existence. And if so, the question is, how does this both fit together? How does this fit together? On the one hand, you say that it's specifically children, there's specifically the children who offer the karbanos, that they make the world exist, and yet the Medrash itself continues and says in Tanchuma and says that it's also every individual, even an adult. Therefore, says the Rebbe, we must come to the following conclusion: that yes, in general, anybody who reads about the karbanos, it's as if they are sustaining the world. However, there is something unique. There is a special, so to speak, advantage in the children specifically, when they read the karbanos, that through them is effective and a much greater, so to speak, a much greater enhanced level of existence of the world. What does this all mean? In other words, what's so unique about the children? So the Rebbe says we'll understand this by first prefacing and an explanation in the whole idea of Noach, which we brought already before. And that is in the pasuk in Parshas Noach, where it says that Hashem instructed him to take from all, quote, Mikol habe'ema ha'torah, from all the kosher animals, from all the pure animals. The Gemara asks, were there such a concept of kosher and non-kosher, pure and not pure in that time, prior to Matan Torah? And the Gemara answers that it means from, quote, those that will later, after Matan Torah that is, those that will later be tahor, that will later be kosher animals. This means, in other words, that by Noach, there was a unique contrast. There was almost like something, two opposites that came to play together. On the one hand, Noach, when he offered a korban, he didn't offer it in the status of a mitzvah, because there were no mitzvahs. Not only the Torah wasn't yet given, but we don't find anywhere that Noach should be like the Avos, like the patriarchs, who actually fulfilled the entire Torah even prior to its giving, quote unquote. Rather, he offered the karbanos as an individual, as anybody offered it prior to Matan Torah. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, meaning no connection to the Matan Torah, no connection whatsoever, not even in the state of fulfillment as the Avos. Yet on the other hand, what you find is that Noach specifically offered karbanos, which would later, after the Torah is given, which would later be kosher karbanos. So from this comes out that what? That Noach had some connection. Noach had some connection to the status, to the concept of Torah, even prior to it being offered, and therefore he had a knowledge, and he had a connection through his deeds, through his actions, to that which will be after Matan Torah. And since we find the connection of Noach to Matan Torah, even before Matan Torah, but in connection to what? In correlation with what? With the concept of karbanos. Therefore, this leads us to say that this leads us to the conclusion that the concept of karbanos plays a role and has a status and had a value, so to speak, even before to the Torah being given, because that's where we find his connection expressed. The connection of Noach to Matan Torah is expressed by the virtue of him offering the korban. What is the explanation? What does this mean? You see, even the karbanos, even the offerings that are offered after Matan Torah, which of course after Matan Torah they assume the status of a mitzvah. It's one of the many mitzvahs in the Torah. Yet their effect, meaning the accomplishment, the effect of a korban is greater than the Torah and mitzvahs itself. Which explains why when a Yid, even if a Yid chas v'shalom committed a sin, by offering a korban, the Jew is able to atone for the sin. So that shows that the korban, even after Matan Torah, is higher than the Torah and mitzvahs itself. Or perhaps in a different way of expressing this, the karbanos bring to a person so close to Hashem that it reveals that essential bond that's there, that exists between a Yid and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a Yid and Hashem, that this is the reason why it's able to even atone for the lack of fulfillment or perhaps a transgression of Torah and mitzvahs. According to this, we'll get a better understanding in the concept of karbanos in general. Because on the one hand, you can really ask, what is really this whole idea of offering a korban? If you think about it, you're doing a physical act of offering, of slaughtering and offering the blood of a behemoth, and this serves as a means of tshuva. This serves as a means of atonement for a sin that was committed or for the lack of fulfillment of a mitzvah. Now, it wouldn't seem to make sense, because it would make more sense, perhaps, if one was required to do tshuva, to do meditation, to do contemplation. In other words, to use their mind, to use their thoughts, to use their heart. Perhaps that could be a means, an agent of atonement. How is it that this simple physical act serves as an atonement? But based on what we explained before, that specifically because of the korban becomes expressed this essential connection that goes beyond any whatsoever expression, even the expression of Torah mitzvahs, that comes out specifically through the korban. And this will help us understand how the korban of Noach has a connection to the karbanos that's after Matan Torah. You see, in the davening of Rosh Hashanah, one of the verses which we say to evoke Hashem's memory of us is we bring the verse which was at the end of the Mabul, where it says Vayikra Elokim es Noach, that Hashem remembered Noach and all the people that were there with him in the Teva. What was this all about? And why do we bring it on Rosh Hashanah? What is the connection to us? Hashem remembered Noach. It doesn't say Hashem remembered Bnei Yisrael. But the answer is that this is because, why did Hashem remember Noach? This is because of the Bnei Yisrael that was supposed to descend later, was supposed to come later from Noach and his family, and had Chas v'Shalom Hashem not remembered Noach and not saved them, then we wouldn't be here. In other words, the reason why we're saying it Rosh Hashanah, what we're saying is that Hashem remembered Noach back then because of the essential connection between us and Hashem, which was then at that time included in Noach and his family, because they were, so to speak, the seed for it. They were remembered because of us even prior to us having the quote-unquote value, the status of importance as a result of the Torah and mitzvahs. So from this it comes out that even though Noach was there before Matan Torah and before the Avos, who already connected themselves to Matan Torah by virtue of their observance of the Torah, still there's already a connection to Am Yisrael. And now we can better understand why the karbanos that come in connection to this remembrance of Noach, that Hashem saved Noach, and then he came out of the Teva and he offered the karbanos, how that connects to Bnei Yisrael. And this is the explanation why the Medrash uses the expression, the term, v'ha-karbanos tahirim, that the karbanos atoher are pure. This is to emphasize that the karbanos which we offer today, during the times of the Beis Hamikdash, or which we read about today when we read the Parshas HaKarbanos, even though they come already post Matan Torah, and they already have a status of a mitzvah, and therefore you don't see in a revealed state, you don't see how the karbanos really express that essential connection between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael. Still what we're saying is that they have, deep down, they have this maila, they have the advantage of the karbanos of Noach, which came before Matan Torah, which expresses very clearly and very obviously that essential connection, that inherent connection that's there between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael. And now we can better appreciate why it is that we start to learn this with children, why we start to talk about karbanos. Now that we explained how it connects to Noach and it expresses the essential connection, now we can better appreciate it. You see, these three time periods that the Rebbe says, that is, post Matan Torah, and then the Avos, which although was prior to Matan Torah, still it had a very strong connection to Matan Torah, and then the third time period, which is Noach, which comes even before of any whatsoever connection to Matan Torah. This parallels to the three time periods in a person's life. You have a period of time where a person is very obviously connected to Torah and mitzvahs, and that is post Bar and Bas Mitzvah. Then you have the time period prior to that, which is parallel perhaps to the time period of the Avos, which are not fully obligated, yet there is already a status of Torah mitzvahs, namely when higiu lechinuch, when you reach the age of maturity, the age that you can be expected to already comprehend and appreciate Torah mitzvahs. Thus, one is obligated according to halacha to perform mitzvahs to a certain extent. Then there is a third time period, which is very parallel to the time of Noach, which seems to be devoid of any whatsoever obligation of Torah and mitzvahs. That is when a child is still yet a very, very young child, just barely able to speak, or just about able to speak, and they don't really have any whatsoever capacity of comprehension and maturity, and therefore they're not obligated to mitzvahs. And this we see actually where it's really even more expressed, the fact that although there's not an active active connection, an active role that the child plays in Torah mitzvahs, because like we said, they're not even mature enough to be in the status of chinuch, to parallel that time period of the avos. But still, what do we learn? What does the Torah tell us? That the inherent connection of Torah mitzvahs to every single Jew is Torah tziva lanu Moshe moirasha kehilasake. Moirasha means a yerusha, it's an inheritance. And as we said in the introduction, inheritance is something which you don't need to have any cognitive or mature capacity in order to inherit. It comes automatic. This expresses that essential connection between every single Yid and Hashem. And since a little child, there's no distinguishable connection to Torah. The only connection to Torah is, like we said, this inheritance, this essential connection that there is between Hashem and the Yidden. Therefore, it parallels to that. Therefore, they connect to the karban, to that time period, which is in the time of Noach. And now we can understand what the Medrash means when it says, let the Tahirim come, let the pure ones come. Those that, quote, didn't even taste the taste of sin, meaning they're so pure, they're so innocent, and let them engage in Tahirim, in the purity, in the karbanos that are, quote, from before Matan Torah. And now we can understand and appreciate that and answer the question that we asked in the Tanchuma. We can appreciate the difference between the reading of karbanos between adults and little tiny children. You see, when an adult reads about the karbanos, by virtue of the fact that he's an adult, once they're reading, they're understanding. There's a certain cognitive involvement. And once they're understanding, so their mind, their intellect, and their heart, their emotions are already involved. So it operates on a certain limitation, depending on the person, depending on their capacity, depending on their greatness. So it already lacks that true purity, that true innocence. And especially there's no action here, because it's merely it becomes translated not just into merely recital of words, but it becomes translated into emotions, into thoughts, into contemplation. Whereas when a child reads these psukim, and when you begin reading with a child, these psukim are just read. They're just repeated, which is pure action. And like we said, although the action seems to be less than, but the action of the korban brings out the depth of it, the essential connection that there is between a Yid and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and this triggers that the revelation of it, that Hashem reveals this essential connection between a Yid and the Eibishter.